Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to I'll be starting things off. So a warm welcome to everyone. And I guess good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us today. For those of you who I've yet to meet, my name is Kerry Shillito. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Director of Philanthropy here at the Equality Fund. And so what does that actually mean? Basically, I serve as an advisor and facilitator for philanthropy in our community, helping you think strategically and meaningfully about your contributions to gender equity through the Equality Fund. So today I join you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I am fortunate to live, play, and raise my family on the beautiful lands in the city of Vancouver. I identify as being of African descent through the Caribbean and transatlantic slavery, as well as British descent. And I acknowledge that I am a settler on these lands. Like all of you, I am grateful to be a part of this collective work, standing in solidarity with movements fighting for gender justice. I now invite you in the chat to introduce yourselves. And if you feel comfortable, please share the traditional territories you are joining from, as well as your background or ancestry. Just going to pause here for a couple seconds. I know many of you in the Zoom room are donor partners, so some of you are new to our community and others who have been with us for years, even before we were the Equality Fund. So regardless of where you are on your journey, I want to express our deep gratitude on behalf of the entire Equality Fund team. Thank you for your partnership. Thank you for your commitment. And thank you for your generosity. As we enter our 5th year of operation as the Equality Fund, I am so proud to share that together, we have supported over 1,000 women's rights organizations and feminist movements in 100 countries. And of course, we are just getting started because we know that there is so much more work to be done. So today with that, I am thrilled to guide a conversation for you with a true powerhouse in our field, Cynthia Eyakuze. As co-vice president of global programs at the Equality Fund, Cynthia has established herself as a formidable advocate for meaningful change and innovative grant-making strategies. Her work not only drives our mission forward, but also inspires countless others in the community. In today's discussion, we'll explore our global programs and grant-making strategies, including the exciting launch of our Prepare stream of grant-making. We'll also have time for a Q&A, of course, so please don't hesitate to share any questions you may have in the chat along the way. While we might not be able to get to all of them today, please rest assured that we'll follow up with resources and responses afterwards. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce my colleague, Cynthia. So Cynthia, I'm going to turn it over to you to start with giving us an overview of your background and expertise and your role. However, and I know I pre-warned you for this, what I would love for you to put in the mix of your intro is just share with us your go-to comfort food, especially as we are hitting this autumn season. And I invite everybody in the Zoom chat to also chime in with your comfort food for this autumn season.
Thank you so much, Kerry. And it's really exciting to be in this conversation with so many of our important partners that support the work that we get to do in the grant making team in particular. So Cynthia Eyakuze, I use she, her pronouns, and I am based in the Bronx. So New York City is the land of the Lenape people, and I'm grateful to be a visitor and a temporary visitor because I do intend to go home. And home for me is Tanzania. And before I perhaps say a little bit more about my background and my work and what brought me to Equality Fund, the food. So I am Tanzanian. I am also a New Yorker. I am not an American because that would mean giving up my Tanzanian citizenship, which I'm not prepared to do as yet. My favorite food is my traditional food. So within Tanzania, I'm from the west of the country, Bukoba region. And our traditional food is banana based. It is green bananas. We cook it in different ways. It can be stews, generally, but stewed bananas with beans. And it's my absolute favorite food. I cannot get it here at all. I've tried with different kinds of bananas, but I will be home in about 10 days along a trip with our CEO, Jess, to Kenya to meet with some grantee partners on our way to various other meetings. So I'm very excited to be able to eat some comfort food. So I have been working as a feminist activist for 30 years now. I began as a young activist around the time of the Beijing conference. So it's interesting to see us coming up to 30 years of the Beijing conference, but I have done everything from the work to, establish the really important formative frameworks that we have that guide a lot of our work, that touch on a range of issues from not only women's rights, environmental, sexual and reproductive health and rights, habitat, alongside a whole number of really important frameworks that were really established in the 1990s. I then did a bunch of work on seeing how these frameworks are interpreted nationally, are implemented nationally, and then I worked in philanthropy for about 10 years before joining the Equality Fund. I am particularly excited to be doing philanthropic work in a unashamedly feminist organization. It makes a huge difference as to the kind of work that we're able to do. So that is very briefly in a nutshell my journey to Equality Fund and a little bit about my background. And I do this work because as an African woman and seeing how gender equality or inequality rather plays out in our lives, it's just been a lifelong mission of mine to do this work, and particularly in some ways to do it sort of from the global north, which has a lot of power and influence in what happens in my country and region and other regions. So it's really been kind of a lifelong work to do my best to kind of influence that work as an African working at it from the global north through different organizations and finally within philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that. And would you be able to share with us a little bit about your top 3 to 5 highlights of global programs over the last 5 years since we've been the Equality Fund? Any highlights that have stood out to you during your time at the Equality Fund?
Oh my goodness, that's a hard question.
It's always,
yes. There is so much. Perhaps I would start with the intentionality with which we do our work. We are really 100% committed to responding to what we hear from feminist organizations and movements. What do they need? We have heard for decades about the importance of the quality, not only getting quantity in terms of grant funding and resources, but the quality of that work. And we are 100% dedicated to ensuring that we provide the best quality of resources. All our grant making is informed by what the movements are saying they need and how it is that they need those resources. And I'm particularly proud about how we undertake this work. And I'll share a little bit about sort of what this looks like in practice. I am also very proud for such a young organization. We barely hit 5 years, actually. We're coming up to 5 years. And so to reinforce those figures that you shared, Kerry, about being able to be in partnership or to resource up to 1,000 organizations, 100 of those directly, and the additional, really importantly, through our network of peer feminist funders, of which we're in partnership with over 30 right now. And so that is what enables this reach. It is what enables us to fund from the smallest emerging organizations that are able to receive 1,000 to very large, established, really important actors in, for example, the crisis response sectors such as the Sisterhood of Urgent Action funds, and everywhere sort of in between. We're really able to do this because of how it is that we work with the ecosystem. So for such a scrappy organization to be able to say that we have committed up to $100 million in less than 5 years, and of that we have dispersed 80 million, is nothing short of amazing. And I'm incredibly proud of the team, where we have gone from 7 million one year to 14 million to 20 million to this year we are on track to disperse 28 million. So that's another thing that I'm very, very proud of. I'm also very proud of the partnerships that we work with. These are partnerships that enable us to be really nimble, particularly in responding to crises. We're just living in an increasingly sort of crisis-ridden world. Now, this is not news to us as feminist activists, but it really is, I think, fair to say that we're just seeing increasing crises, increasingly compounded crisis, and the role of feminist organizations could not be more important. Scrappy as we are, we're doing our best, and we will certainly be pushing for more resources from the actors that have a good amount of resources to respond to crises, but unfortunately those are not yet necessarily available to feminist crisis responders, who oftentimes are on the front lines of doing really important work. So, that's just sort of one example of the kinds of partnerships that I'm very proud of. I would say, sort of one of my, yes, there's a bias. One of my things that I'm most proud of is how we also pay particular attention to the most marginalized, the most structurally marginalized, the most ignored in the mainstream media that many of us consume, particularly given where many of us are based. There are so many hidden, protracted, forgotten crises, and we really have a deep commitment at the Equality Fund to ensuring that we are supporting and resourcing them, both financially and wherever possible, to amplify the work and the importance of the work that is being done. So that can be anywhere from Haiti, that can be Sudan, that can be the earthquake in Turkey that affected a large population of Syrian refugees that were oftentimes forgotten. We also, of course, are supporting the feminist activists in the crises that are very much on the front pages, whether it's Ukraine, perhaps increasingly less so on the front pages, but we have been very much part of supporting feminist crisis response in Ukraine, in Afghanistan as well. Unfortunately, we're no longer able to because of the government that is there now, but we continue to advocate with the Canadian government as to how, are there ways in which we can support what is really fair to say is now, an apartheid system for women in Afghanistan is just having really just devastating impacts there. So I'm very proud that we can both focus on those that are in our headlines, but really importantly, the forgotten crises, those are not on our front pages that we're not hearing about, but that really do remain equally important. And that is one of the ways in which we live our intersectionality as an organization. I think I hit on 4, I hope.
Oh, that is amazing. Thank you, Cynthia. I mean, it's so amazing, the 30 years of experience that you have, the pride and how you speak about the work. I was also wondering if there is a story you want to share with us from your time with the Equality Fund. I mean, you spoke about the breadth and sort of different, but is there a story that you people may kind of, it helps to understand a bit behind the scenes of the work and yes, what it means with what you're doing?
So one of my absolute favorite innovations, it's really fair to call it an innovation, is how we went about grant making to our peers. So this was a big challenge because we went from one of the smaller members of the feminist eco-funding system. You may be familiar with Prospera, which is the international network of women's funds that comprises a little over 40 feminist funds, from national to regional to international, in some instances sub-regional as well. And so the question for us is, can we make this a competitive process? What does it mean for Equality Fund to be in a position of making decisions about which of our peers would be funded? And we had a wonderful colleague who came from the Prospera Secretariat before she joined Equality Fund, who in consultation with the network came up with an approach that we describe as step up, step back, that is entirely non-competitive. And this really is an innovation in philanthropy, No, in philanthropy, we're always having, we do calls, we can be participatory in some instances, but it is very, very rare for grant making to be done in a non-competitive fashion. And the way that we did it was to invite organizations, peer organizations, to think of their institutional needs within the context of the ecosystem, and invited them to think about perhaps where might they be the greatest need in that moment. That was about 3 years ago when we did the first round of Step Up, Step Back. And we had a number of organizations that stepped up, and we had a number of organizations that stepped back. And some of the reasons given for the organizations that step back is, for this year, for the next 2 years, we feel that we're actually okay in terms of the budget that we have, and or we have other grant making opportunities. But we see that our peers, particularly national organizations in the global South, have a much harder time accessing resources. And so for them to be able to have access to a pretty significant amount of bilateral funding, especially, which is quite hard because the sort of the due diligence is quite strict. And so the fact that we were able to, in community, agree that we will have a non-competitive process. We have now done 2 rounds of Step Up, Step Back. A number of those that did not step up in the first round have stepped up in the second round. Some of the reasons they gave being the crisis context that they saw in the 2 years since the first round of Step Up, Step Back, and the second round, an exponential demand in resources from their entities that they were not able to meet. On average, our feminist funds meet about 15 to 20% of the eligible demand that they get. And it's not that different from us at Equality Fund when we have done an open call, such as for Prepare. So that is one of the things that I'm hugely inspired in terms of the creative thinking, the commitment to the ecosystem, and also the intentionality behind how we do the work and how we try to shift the practices in philanthropy that set us up in competition with each other. So as a result of Step Up, Step Back, we are actually funding every single eligible feminist fund, eligibility being largely around sort of the ODA requirements that we have as Equality Fund with our funding from the Canadian and the British government in particular. But we have been able to, we are now in partnership, financial and other partnerships with every single eligible feminist fund, that is over 30 feminist funds, because we have taken this non-competitive approach. So I'm always very excited when I talk about this, and it's just a wonderful innovation.
That's beautiful, Cynthia. Thank you for sharing that. It's definitely something about our sector and the collective, sort of the whole ecosystem, and thinking about that collective and community and abundance as well. So yes, thank you for that. And I'm going to shift gears now and move on to the topic of the Prepare grants that we know that are still underway. So I do understand that it's difficult to share too much information given that they are underway. But could you perhaps share a little bit about the expression of interest process to date, how it was designed, or anything key that you feel might be of interest to the group in the chat today?
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to do that, and perhaps just begin with a very quick kind of overview of what our grant making looks like. What is the focus of our grant making? So we do not have thematic priorities. The way that we think about our grant making is, how do we support the ecosystem of feminist organizations and movements in terms of the infrastructure and how we are self-structured. So we're structured as individual organizations, nationally, regionally, international. We also have the ecosystem of feminist funds that I just described, of doing Step Up, Step Back. We're also organized through networks, coalitions, consortia. So those are sort of, very broadly speaking, kind of the infrastructure of the ecosystem of feminist organizations and movements. And our grant making is set up accordingly. So we have Catalyze, which is our grant making to individual organizations. We have Activate, which is our grant making to feminist funds. We have Connect, which is the grant making that is, we sometimes refer to it as sort of the connective tissue. Networks, coalitions, even convenings that bring together feminists regionally or globally for really important, networking, but also strategic conversations. Out of these convenings is where the Black Feminist Fund, for example, was born. Is the most recent example I can think of, but there are many more that I know we can we can point to. The fourth stream, we have 4 streams. The fourth one is the one that we describe as our one and only thematic stream. But again, it is not issue specific. It is a stream that is intended to address the crises that feminist organizations and movements are responding to because of just the impact that this has on the communities that they are working with. And so that stream is called Prepare, Respond, and Care. And it is named very intentionally. A lot of the work that we have been doing on this stream that we began, I would say about 2.5 years ago, has been largely within Respond. When emerging crises have happened that have affected the community with which we work, we have been responsive to them. And we have done top-up grants, for example, to catalyze grantees, which is individual organizations. We have also done top-up grants to a mix of feminist funds whose core business is actually crisis response, again, such as the Urgent Action Fund or the Ukrainian Women's Fund, which finds itself in an ongoing conflict situation. And so much of their funding has now had to pivot towards crisis responses. But there are also other feminist funds, whether it's Doria Fund that works in the Middle East and North Africa, that is now finds itself responding because of the demand that they're receiving to crises. So in those instances, we have a robust response body of grant making that is, right now we're up to about 10 million in grants that we have dispersed and or committed to the Respond. Care is very much integrated into the responses that feminist organizations do in their when they're confronted with crisis. So again, the Urgent Action Funds, I Am Defensora's, Ukrainian Women's Fund will tell you about the kind of work, whether it is psychosocial support that they are providing, whether it is having to think about the kind of care that their own staff need, as was described to us by one of our grantee partners that works on Syria with Syrian refugees around the world. They're called Women Now for Development. And in a conversation with them just last week, they were talking about the toll that these never-ending, ever-growing crises is taking on themselves as an organization and their staff as they're constantly meeting the needs. So on the one hand, they're providing care, sort of programming and support for communities, and at the same time, they've recognized that they need to integrate care into their own work and restoration, et cetera, so that they're able to continue doing this work. So to prepare, which is the call that we have currently, that we are reviewing currently, Prepare for us was really an important opportunity to support the ecosystem, to not have everybody in the business of putting out fires and in constantly responding to crises. But we felt it was really important to signal the importance of work that speaks to visioning the future. What might a future look like if you're not constantly in defense mode and putting out fires? What does it mean to prepare? What does it mean even, how do we define crisis? That's a whole body of work to help us as Equality Fund get conceptual clarity and frameworks about how a feminist responders, communities defining crises. Gender-based violence is not defined as crisis in the humanitarian sector. It may be seen in the context of specific conflicts or humanitarian disasters, and we know that gender-based violence goes up exponentially when crisis happens. But it is fair to say that globally, gender-based violence is a crisis. It's just not recognized as a crisis. So we needed to kind of expand a little bit our thinking of that, and we did that. And at the same time, we undertook an exercise to help us get clarity about what are the hallmarks, what are the key elements of feminist crisis responses. And we heard a lot about the desire, the need, the importance of visioning, the desire, the need for thinking about early warning systems. Some climate disasters are not new. What happens in the Caribbean, the hurricanes and the impact and the ever devastating impact of these are not new. They happen cyclically, but we're not prepared. The funding world is not set up, so that people can, and organizations, et cetera, can be forward thinking, et cetera. So that was really the intention behind Prepare, is to signal that this is as important aspect of thinking about and responding to crisis as the immediate, humanitarian responses and other related crisis responses when a crisis actually happens. And so the approach that we have taken, because it is a very, we recognize sort of in conversations, and this has borne out in the applications that we received, it's not a familiar way for many organizations to think about about their work. And so we wanted, again, in doing the call, we wanted to signal, we wanted to, spread the call also to organizations that we were not already in partnership with. So that is actually one parameter that we put to say, we do have a pot. There are, we have 100 million already committed to a number of organizations. We didn't want for the same organizations to then be the main ones that would have access. So we asked that the organizations that are already in partnership, financial partnership with Equality Fund, not apply. We encourage them to be in collaborations and partnerships with others that may be applying, but not to be the first ones who applied. So we put out the call at the end of June with about sort of 4 priority areas, some which I've mentioned, such as visioning, kind of thinking about early warning systems, etc. And we received over 1,000 expressions of interest for this, of which around 400 or so were eligible for review. We will only be able to make about 6 grants for this. There will be 6 rather large grants, amongst the largest grants actually that we are doing at Equality Fund to date. So up to about $1 million over 2 years is what we are aiming for in this sort of pilot phase, I would say, of Prepare. We are working with external advisors who are bringing expertise in crises, but also regional and other thematic expertise. So for example, if we were anticipating, for example, some of the preparedness work relates to some legal strategies, that's not necessarily expertise that we have within Equality Fund. So we wanted to ensure that we have we have a group of 6 advisors that we're working with, that some of them have funding experience, some of them are movement activists themselves. We have, they're spread across all the regions, the geographies in which we work, and they also bring kind of a range of skill sets, such as I mentioned, legal, but also other kind of skills that they bring into this work. So we have been able to do an initial round of deliberations about the expressions of interest to narrow down the organizations that will be invited. And I believe the invitation will be going out sometime this week to those that have been invited to submit a full proposal. They'll be given a month to prepare that proposal. And we will once again work with our advisors as well as with the core team that comprises myself, our director of program strategy that comes with over 20 years of experience working on crisis, our senior program officer who has worked as a long background in the Middle East and doing a lot of work on crisis. So that's sort of our core group. We draw on, of course, other colleagues within the Equality Fund, but we will work with this advisory group to do the final kind of selection of the cohort, the initial cohort of Prepare grantees. And we're aiming to finalize everything, go through our internal docket process, et cetera. And by the first quarter of next year, we will be able to announce who the initial kind of cohort of 6 Prepare grantee partners will be. And we've had a lot of really interesting applications. And I will say, to go back to my earlier point about the importance of signaling this, is a significant number of the applications were actually really sat in response. So that is, again, just signaling the huge need that is out there. So it is important information for us as Equality Fund, as we think through our overarching Stream 4. It is also very important as we engage with other partners, whether it is the feminist funds, but also other funders in the humanitarian sectors, to demonstrate the need. We know these organizations, so we can do a lot of interesting advocacy work, resource advocacy work as well, to try to kind of, bridge this huge need, or to meet this huge need, and bridge the gap that not only we're seeing, but as I mentioned, the other peer funders in the ecosystem.
Cynthia, thank you. That, I'm only 3 months into my job. I mean, I can listen to you forever, Cynthia. Every day I get blown away about the expertise, the thoughtfulness, just what we are doing in the ecosystem. And just one thing that you had mentioned, the fact that there were 400 viable, I think the applications in 6, and just kind of that whole circling back to that piece that, there's still so much more that needs to be done. So just speaking to the need that's out there, that's quite interesting. We're going to head to questions very soon, but I thought what might be interesting, because I know we talk in our sector a lot about this term participatory grant making. It's such a buzzword, right? And what I thought it would be great, for me, sometimes, I hear it defined in different ways. And I think many people sometimes when they hear the buzzword, they might not fully know what we mean. So I thought maybe we can just spend a couple of minutes just understanding what does that mean, participatory grant making, and how does that work in practice at the Equality Fund? And I think you've already spoken to a little bit of that anyways.
Right. So I think of participatory along a continuum. There's so many different forms of participatory. There's a whole sector, there's whole communities of practice around participatory grant making, but certainly from the perspective of Equality Fund and how we have come at it from, again, the continuum of consultations. We held very deep consultations before we even began grant making as Equality Fund with the feminist movement. We did that in partnership with the Association of Women in Development, AWID, which is a membership organization comprising thousands of organizations and individuals. So we did deep consultations about their expectations, their desires, their recommendations, their advice to Equality Fund. And that report is called High Hopes. We responded where we could meet each other with shared hopes. And so that was one example of participation. Sort of along the continuum is consultations. We have brought it into grant making through the Step Up, Step Back, as I said, which is a non-competitive. It was very much in consultation with our peers to design what this process could look like so that no one person was making decisions. The only person who was making decision was the institution itself that was deciding whether they would step up or step back. We have used some slightly more sort of traditional, I think more understood forms of more along the continuum, which is the advisory groups. So Catalyze, we used an advisory group. Once we were able to shortlist organizations that were truly, feminist, that again, advisors felt that this work is interesting. Advisors were regionally focused so that they could really weigh in. They could advise based on the context, based on the organization and that organization's role in the field and relationships and partnerships with others in the field. In that instance, the advisory group made the final recommendations. I sat in the second round of advisory groups and at least one or two of the organizations that I hoped would be funded were not funded. And whatever the advisors, recommended is who we funded. We did not question, change the decisions of the advisors, regardless of how we as staff may have felt about an organization. So that is the participatory approach that we took with Catalyze. And as I've said, with Prepare, we're using a similar kind of approach. And so, along the continuum, I guess the furthest end is who actually makes the decision about who will be funded. And so with Catalyze, it was the advisors who said, this is this is who we're recommending be funded. And it is going to be a little bit of a hybrid with Prepare because the staff as well as the advisors will be making joint decisions. And it is important for Prepare because of this, for lack of a better word, thematic, because of the piloting nature, because of the substantive nature and the importance of demonstrating to the broader sort of crisis response field what this work means. And so that is going to ask of us to accompany this work in a particular way. And so we want to be really intentional about the mix, the types of strategies that are being used, the geographic scope, the types of organizations, et cetera. So we will be playing a more sort of engaged role alongside our advisors that we played in Catalyze, where the advisors had that final recommendation decision. In this instance, it'll be a little bit of a combination of the advisors alongside the three core staff that I mentioned, deliberating, et cetera, coming to agreement as to who should be the final organizations to be funded. And then there's a lot more, within sort of the participatory, I think community type organizations do really interesting participatory approaches within our peer feminist funds. There's a whole range of really interesting participatory, from the consultation to the decision-making. For example, young feminist activists will themselves in a country decide, who should be funded, et cetera.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Cynthia. And so we're going to open it up to questions now. Cynthia, I believe you're our lead. We're going to watch for, so what we're asking people to do is to raise their hands or share your question in the chat. The chat is being monitored. And just want to remind everyone that we will not be able to get to all questions, but we are more than happy to follow up with answers to the ones that we can't get to. So I don't know if we can see everybody, Cynthia. do we have everybody? Oh, I see a hand up. Should I? Okay, I'll help you. I'll help you facilitate this.
Yes,
Cynthia.
that would be great. Actually, Kerry, if you could help sort of collate the questions while
Oh,
I think through the answers.
of course.
Thank you.
I see Hunter McGill with your hand up. Hunter, I'll let you take yourself off mute to ask the question.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and thank you, Cynthia, for a very enlightening explanation of the work that you're doing. Kerry, if I may just take a moment or two to introduce myself. I have been involved with humanitarian response work for about 25 years, both with the Canadian government, with an international organization, and now I am teaching a course on humanitarian response. The work that the Equality Fund is engaging with now, I think, is enormously important, because what we have seen far too often is a very, you might almost say, neo-colonialist approach by international organizations, both civil society and United Nations and other organizations, to working with populations affected by humanitarian crises, whether they're conflict related or natural resource related. And what the research has shown is far too few occasions, far too few response reactions by important international partners have taken the approach of empowering the populations affected by these crises. And as we know, research shows that the majority of the populations most seriously affected by these crises are women and girl children. And empowering them to take control of the response, even by such a, what it would seem to be a very simple approach, to say to the affected population, what do you want? What do you need? What is your perception of a response which will enable you to deal with a crisis that you are experiencing? That question just does not seem to occur to many people in the response machinery. And the unfortunate part is that it reduces the effectiveness of the response, because in many cases the response is based on a set of assumptions from other contexts, from history, which is an important teacher for us, but nonetheless is not necessarily, because the context of humanitarian response is constantly evolving. There are very important lessons to be learned, but not necessarily all of them have in fact been internalized in the operations of the response agencies, the response partners. So my question, and I apologize for the long preamble, it comes from, I also teach a course on humanitarian assistance. My students would tell you that my preambles are far too long. But how can this empowerment of local responders, who in fact for crises are the immediate responders, they are the closest response bodies to the populations affected, how can those agencies, plus of course the international partners, how can they be encouraged and led to take a much more assertive role in terms of empowering the people that they want to assist? It might go so far as just to say, in these enormous refugee camps that exist in so many parts of the world now, that in fact, women become the key leaders and decision makers in those camps, deciding what are the priorities for the response to the refugee population's needs. What about planning? How can the goal of resilience, even for refugee populations, be pursued, be actively embedded in the work that the response agencies do? Again, I keep coming back to this issue about empowerment. It is so fundamental.
Yeah.
When one looks at situations I've studied a bit the refugee camps in Kenya and Uganda, where you have 3 generations of populations of a family who have lived there. What can be done to enable those people to prepare for what one always hopes is a possibility for those people to return to their homes, but also just to empower them to improve and manage their situation in the context in which they live. Thank you
Thanks,
very
Hunter.
much,
Thank you
Kerry,
so
for
much.
that.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing your background. And I'm just gonna pass it to Cynthia to answer that question. Thank you, Hunter, for that.
I mean, that's sort of the hundreds of billion-dollar question, Hunter. And I say that because those are the resources that the humanitarian sector holds and wields, and with that comes power. So first of all, the women crisis responders are embedded in their communities, and they are leaders in their communities. They are already empowered. They have their own power. They act from a place of agency and power. The challenge comes, and they vision, and they don't see what came out very, very strongly. We knew this intuitively, but what came out very strong in the research is that crises are not events. No, crises are processes. Well, a hurricane perhaps may be an event, but they exacerbate structural issues that then, around sort of vulnerabilities, et cetera. But the communities, the women's rights organizations and leaders themselves have been doing the work in their communities. And that is the first, I would say, really important point to make. And they're doing the immediate needs responses, and they know very well what needs to be done. They know very well the kind of infrastructure, building. They know very well the political changes, et cetera. They have all that, but they are excluded from the spaces. And that is the biggest challenge. They are excluded by governments. They are excluded by the UN entities themselves. We unfortunately hear about the major struggle of Syrian women activists who have been on the front line of responding, and how they are excluded even by UN Women from being on the table that is discussing what next. And we have multiple examples of this. We're in partnership with organizations, and I'm struck because I was in conversation with her just last Friday, the director of advocacy of MADRE, which for decades is a women's rights organization that has been working in some of the most forgotten crises. And they have been, again, with the same organizations for decades, because these are compounded crises that sort of feel like they have no end. And one of the things that they were saying that they see their role as is to keep the doors open, to keep the channels open. So when they're based in New York, they have access to DC. They constantly are doing advocacy so that when organizations such as women's rights organizations in Syria are wanting to come to the table, the channel is already prepared. It is very hard for organizations that don't already have those channels and who are suddenly invited, like, oh, there's a bit of a tokenism that may happen. There's a risk of that, of sort of, we had these women and you have the photo of the women, but there isn't then the follow-up. So there is, I think it's fair to say there is resistance in terms of the power that comes with the billions in this industry, and shifting that requires for the large organizations to give up some of their power. Now, a really exciting development that is underway, that in our view is going to help unlock some of these billions, where we're not going to be starting with the billions, but we certainly hope to get there, is discussions that came out of a convening that we held in collaboration with the British government around feminist responses to crises, where the women and gender team invited their colleagues from the humanitarian sector to really be in a one-on-one conversation, to hear from feminist crisis responders about what this looks like, what this means, what their needs are. As a result of that meeting, there is now interest in the idea of setting up a pooled fund that would bring together humanitarian funding that would be accessible to women's rights and frontline responders for whom it is much harder to access the bigger money coming from the international NGOs or indeed from bilateral organizations, but that can be channeled again through this network of peer funds that are able to disperse from the smallest amount, as well as to engage in the policy conversations, et cetera. So we're very, very excited about that as a new initiative. It provides us then, the possibilities for engaging from a place of a little bit of power, because that is the reality. If we come in with a little bit of money, we're able to sit at the table a little bit differently. And so for us, the more that the first responders are resourced robustly and sustainably, I think the better able they are to continue the work of really challenging how the status quo that you saw that you just described. But it's something that we're very aware of, and we're very much, many of our partners are very keen to sort of continue working on. But it is a big challenge. It really is.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. I know we're running out of time, but this one is from Priya Gupta. Hi, Priya out there. So very good question, actually. I'm curious if the Prepare Visioning exercise offers the opportunity to imagine future flourishing as well as planning for future crisis. Put another way, what are we trying to get to? And how will we know when we've got there?
Yes. So the answer is yes to both, Priya. We're trying to do both. We are very much inviting that imagining of the future. And a lot of that imagining does happen in feminist spaces. It's just not resourced. And in fact, again, when we put out the call, I was hoping, and I was kind of, hoping that we'd get like a really large mix of the kinds of future visioning that's not only about preparing for crisis. That is one way to think about preparing for crisis. And in that view, maybe about sort of early warning systems, some clear tactics, etc. But then is that bigger picture of what is the future that we want? And we know we've sat in spaces where feminists are talking about this, and then they get stuck because of how funding, how the philanthropic sector, whether it's governmental, private, etc., how they think what kind of results they want to see. And if you're visioning a future 10, 20 years, it's hard to put that in a log frame. And so as a feminist fund, can we take, how can we sort of facilitate, support this? One example, perhaps I'll give you that sits a little bit in that, space is if we think of kind of, economic or macroeconomic issues, they are at the core of many of the crises that communities find themselves in, whether it is, in my own country, the indigenous, sort of the itinerant Maasai community that is increasingly pushed out of their lands and their communities in the interest of mining, because the land has been sold to very wealthy folk for hunting. Those are crises, but the cause of the crisis is an economic one. So how do we bring in those kinds of questions and visioning and thinking about, macroeconomic issues and how we support feminists to be in macroeconomic spaces? That, in my view, is thinking along the lines of prepare in a longer term frame. So we're definitely trying to do both, think of sort of preparedness with regards to a specific type of crisis, but also preparedness in terms of what kind of world do we want and how do we work towards that, and what are the spaces that we need to be in to work towards that world.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you, Priya, for that question and for joining us from, I think you had put in the chat, London. So there was another question. I realized we have 8 minutes left. And there's another question. It might be a longer answer, Cynthia. So maybe we can just do a sort of quick response, and then I can sort of reach out with a more fulsome answer. But it's from our friend Heidi. Hi, Heidi. Are you thinking about how your grant making process will continue to evolve? And if so, what direction do you see it moving?
Right. So Heidi, it's for the question that some of the questions that we are now sort of thinking about as we come up to our 5 years, the first 5 years was what we describe as design and build. We needed to build out each of those streams. And as we were doing that, we were also building out our strategy. And two of sort of the key questions that we needed to take up in our strategy is this notion of, substantive funding, sort of core and flexible funding, and then the long-term funding. And so we had to, have some discussions about, when we say long-term funding, what do we mean realistically from a place of the responsibility that we take when we get into a funding relationship with an organization? What does flexible funding look like? I think the flexible funding, we've sort of got a pretty clear lead. We take on as much of the burden as we can as equality funds, so that we're not putting sort of the lack of flexibility on the organizations that we're funding. The big question that we're now going to be looking at is long-term. What does long-term mean when we as an organization have to raise the resources that we have? So what kind of commitments can we ethically make regarding long-term? In our strategy, our ambition is to do a minimum of 5 years up to 10 years. Now, there will be variation depending on the type, but certainly for Catalyze, which for the core kind of institutions within the ecosystem, that is the aim. So as we come up to 5 years, we now have at least one cohort and a half between Catalyze and between Activate that are coming up to the 5 years. So now we're in a space of, okay, can we make now up to a 10-year commitment? What does that look like? Talk to finance team, etc. Like, how far can we extend this comment? Those are the kinds of questions that we are taking up. I would say another one that we're taking up is regard to our responding to crises. So I described initially that our approach for the respond has largely been, or one of the main has been, where we have existing grantee partners faced with a new and emerging crisis. We have supported them with generally kind of additional funding for that work. And then we have kind of a number of organizations, about 6 organizations whose core business is in crisis. We are now having to take stock about our own internal organizational capacity, as well as strategically what it means to be responding kind of, every 3 or 4 months. Is that in fact the best way to address crises, particularly those that we know, particularly crises that are ongoing, that that are in geographies where these are sustained crises. So those again are some of the bigger sort of strategic questions that we'll need to kind of take up, that we are taking up. We're taking stock of how we have responded to crises. What should we continue doing and doubling down on? What should we be thinking about doing differently? We are really keen to be a lot more forward thinking in thinking about these crises. So, as we're looking at Palestine, well, now it's extended to Lebanon. And now, of course, there are concerns that it could extend further. Well, we can't only think about can we give more grants to Palestine organizations working? Can we, in fact, should we rather be thinking about a Middle East crisis approach, not only for Equality Fund, but again, in the ecosystem? Who else is in this space? What are they doing? Those are the kinds of evolution of our grant making strategy, and that will then affect the processes of our work.
Thank you, Cynthia. So we're just coming to the end. Just before I close it up, Cynthia, if there was one takeaway for us to remember as funders and philanthropists of this work, what would be your one takeaway?
It sounds extremely simplistic, but listen to the organizations and movements. We have been saying, long-term and flexible funding, the importance of that. And we see this constantly in real time at Equality Fund, particularly in our crisis. I was going to say particularly in our crisis, but not only in our crisis. I've spoken in the crisis, where the other thing we tell all our partners is, whatever grant, throw that budget that you sent us out the window when a crisis hits. Use the resources how you need them. We will discuss after, and we will provide additional support, as we can. So that is what flexibility, it enables folk to pivot their funding, to get people out of very dangerous situations, to move money that perhaps they were going to use for policy into meeting basic needs like food, getting people to shelters, etc. We have seen that in a number of instances. Another example of the importance of flexible funding is what we heard recently from our partners in Mongolia, who for maybe a decade and a half, I should say, where the government, committed to kind of 30% representation, women's representation in parliament, then it stalled, then they backtracked, and then an opportunity presented themselves. What the organization told us is that they were able to pivot the flexibility of the Equality Fund funding, enabled them to actually have a focus on the policy and strategic sort of collaborative, et cetera, coalition work that enabled now the election of a little over 25% for the very first time. This is the largest, and then of women in the Mongolian parliament. And it is because they had flexible funding to do the kind of work that was needed rather than very project-specific funding. So those are just some examples that I wanted to give that speak to the importance of flexible funding. And in the case of Mongolia, we've been in relationship with them for a number of years. So also that, what does long-term funding enable? It enables an organization like Madre to be in relationship with organizations such that when Gaza was under attack, they had warehouses and others who were willing without payment to provide access to water and food, etc., because of the longstanding partnership, because Madre has been able to sustain their work over the years. So really, again, just the flexible and the long-term funding, this is what it looks like in practice and the kind of impact that it can have in practice.
Thank you, Cynthia. And just from, I just want to add to that too, just from the side that our team works on in terms of how it all connects. As somebody on the philanthropy team, what that translates to with funders and donors is multi-year support, monthly giving, those sustainable supports that really look long-term with our work. So just wanted to share that from philanthropy space. I know we're at 11. I'm just going to quickly wrap it up. I want to thank everyone for being with us here today. I just want to thank you for your ongoing support as advocates, partners, and donors in our community, and just how important that is as we strive to expand our impact through our global grant-making initiatives. And as we know, this work requires a collective effort, and just even like in ways like this, where we're connecting with each other to enhance our understanding and learning to drive meaningful change. I also want to announce, I know some of you may be aware of the launch of our podcast, Moonshot. So it's a 3-part series that highlights our journey and growth as an organization, a journey that many of you have been a part of. And we'll share links to the podcast in the chat and follow-up communications. And just wanted to also reiterate that, just to remember that the philanthropy team at Equality Fund, we are always here for you. So feel free to reach out anytime to us to discuss your support and your connection with the Equality Fund. Our role is really to facilitate resource mobilization. So please do reach out. We're always delighted to connect and talk to those passionate about making a difference. And lastly, I know I'm 1 minute over, but I wanted to extend my gratitude to my colleagues at the Equality Fund who helped make this discussion possible. So of course, the phenomenal Cynthia and Vidya Nair, who many of you know, our AVP of Philanthropy, Lacey Kempinski, and Thanusha Ratna, Ratna Sapopathy. I'm so sorry, Thanusha, I've been practicing that. So I hope I did do it justice. Thank you. And we're all looking forward as we move forward in community with you to our continued collaboration, our continued learning, and our continued dialogue. So thank you, everyone, and wishing you all the best for the rest of your day.